We have a governance problem on all ends, and what ends up happening is a paralysis, and the paralysis always benefits the bad faith actor.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana College of Business. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. This is the November edition of Incentives and Instincts. I'm here again with our favorite economist, Bryce Ward, and we are excited to be joined by New York Times opinion writer at large, Charlie Warzel. Charlie, you've got a great title. I'm not really sure what it means, but I like it. Can you tell us what your job is?
Oh man, thanks for having me. It's funny you say that because that is, I don't really know what it is either, and when we came up with it, nobody really understood, other than it sounds kind of like I'm roving around the world doing important things. But essentially, I'm like a creature of the internet, I like to say, and I sort of write about the ways in which technology and the internet are shaping, culture at large and society and all kinds of things. And it basically just means that like I follow my curiosities and my instincts, and there's no real, there's no one set path or, we roll with the punches. And so my job at the Times is basically to try to think through. I'm sort of similar to a standard opinion columnist, except it's sort of trying to think through the next generation of that, and what that looks like. So I work a lot with our visual and graphics team to kind of do visual journalism and storytelling. We've done a lot of work in trying to do investigative journalism on the opinion side. So it's the same rigorous reporting and sourcing and dealing with whistleblowers and leaks, but with sort of an opinionated bent, right? Like we're gonna not just give you the story, but sort of tell you how you're supposed to feel about it a little bit, and maybe advocate for what should be done. But yeah, broadly, I write about technology, politics, and media and culture. And so I'm just super interested in systems, the way they're designed, and the effects that they have.
Well, those are areas that are very, very salient at the moment. We're catching you a little over 2 weeks after the election. It's a time where, our information economy is being stress tested by the minute. One of the kind of questions I know you've explored and Bryce and I have explored in our conversations is this nature of we appear to be in a world where we can't find agreement or convergence on truth. And as a journalist, you're an opinion writer, but as a journalist, the truth is something that should be important to you, I would presume. It should be important to all of us. How are you kind of navigating that? Do you agree with that premise? And then if so, how are you kind of navigating it?
Yeah, I really do agree with that premise. It's been a bit of an existential question and crisis that I've been dealing with for a while. Slight backstory to back into this question, but I started writing about the internet professionally and technology in general in around 2009, and that's sort of the advent of real massive Facebook adoption, Twitter's getting off the ground, Instagram, a number of these social networks starting to pop up and really sort of take hold in public consciousness. And as we shifted a lot of our behaviors online, I've watched this transformation happen and really been sort of privileged to have a front row seat on it. And there's a lot of things that I noticed, and a lot of my peers who've been paying attention have noticed over the years. And I think it really started to happen around 2014, 2015, where you really were seeing these communities that were sort of springing up and giving people really helping sort of weave the fabric of an alternate reality. And it was really hard to index the size of that, right? It was really hard to say, am I looking at a really small sample and extrapolating that out widely, or am I, is this actually something that we're seeing at scale? And a lot of these platforms, it's really difficult to take that temperature. I feel increasingly like what I and again my peers who study conspiracy theories and misinformation and disinformation and propaganda and things like that, I feel increasingly that like that what we were seeing was very real and and has become very widespread, and I think that really solidified with me, 2 weeks ago, looking at the election results. I think a lot of people expected a repudiation, especially because of the pandemic, of a Trump presidency, of sort of the of Republican thinking. A lot of people in the media, a lot of people in think tank world and all that were expecting that, and what we saw is we didn't see that at all. We saw really a close to 50-50 split there, and it really does feel like those groups are a bit immovable. And so I am really really concerned about this. I think that especially if you look at the way that the president and his campaign have tried to spin the challenging the results of the election, the way that certain news networks like OAN and Newsmax have sort of bolstered that. I think what we're really looking at is a fissuring of reality to some degree, and information ecosystems that sort of cater to that and allow it to exist. I think that's a really big meaty issue, right? It's not just an information issue. It's an issue about politics. It's an issue. I think there's huge, broad societal trends that are causing this, but I'm incredibly worried about it as a journalist, because I think there's a it's very easy when you work in a place like the New York Times to understand how a big swath of the country sees and views what you do, and it's troubling. And I don't say that as someone who's looking down on these folks, or trying to cast too critical an eye. I just think it's really troubling for a shared consensus for the ability for us to govern. I think it's. I don't think we're there yet, but I think it has the potential, if it kind of continues down this road, to be a real sort of existential crisis for democracy.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah. So, Bryce, you kind of have thought about this, at least in our kind of pre-interview dialogue. You thought about this in terms of, there's disagreement about kind of basic facts about the natural world, whether that's, the world is flat, or various supplements, or what it means to be healthy, things that are maybe debatable with scientific methods. But then there's debate about, or there's lack of agreement about belief about other people and what their motivations are. And, you've got some thinking in that space. How do you kind of digest what you're seeing and what Charlie comments on with this dichotomy that you've proposed?
Sure. So, I mean, again, let's start with the description. The fundamental fact that I think is motivating this conversation is the fact that we can't get to a shared reality. And it's not to say that we ever have a shared reality, but usually there should be some notion of, yeah, we roughly think this is going on. And right now that seems to be expanding out. And, as I mentioned in my note to you, we've always had this. This isn't new, right? But a lot of what it was, say, 20, 30 years ago, is what I would call private, right? I didn't believe that the world was round. Well, if you don't believe that the world is round, it doesn't really matter. The world is round, and like your belief that it's flat doesn't actually affect that much. Or maybe you believe that certain supplements were going to make you super healthy or whatever it is. And there's no science to back up that stuff, but whatever. As long as it didn't harm you physically, then whatever. You could believe that that powder or that vitamin was the secret to your health, or maybe it was a crystal, or whatever it is that you believed. It didn't really matter, right? But what's kind of shifted, or it's not new. Let me be clear. This isn't new, but we have a new means of it that has made it more, I think, widespread. Is the internet allows us to shape our beliefs about other people in ways that are less grounded in reality, because they are less based on my interactions with you and based on the caricature of you that is presented to me on the internet. And this is now a big problem, because if we, in a society that is bound together, whether it's your community, your town, your county, your state, or your country, cannot get to a shared reality about who we are as each other, then, and what we're going to do about policy with respect to each other and what your motivations are and all that kind of stuff, well, then you just keep elevating temperature. And that's when you get to hate. And once you get to hate, and we're pretty much already to hate, and that's part of what we've talked about in the last few episodes, um, I'm not sure how you can have a country anymore, because once you hate each other, and this is where things like QAnon are really disturbing. The fact that so many people are willing to believe that particularly Democratic politicians are truly evil people, right? That you have to believe that they're evil to even believe that it's true. That's really disconcerting from a perspective of how do you keep a society going, particularly a democratic society. And so we've got misinformation, beliefs. That's always going to be there, but we've got to somehow get to the point where people on the demand side of the information market are trying to learn the truth about other people in society. And on the supply side, we've done some things to impose some gatekeeping so that we can actually get to the truth more easily without having to weed through a bunch of garbage.
So you talk about gatekeeping in there, and Charlie, I know you've written about how the social media platforms are kind of trying to cope with this problem, although at the same time they are arguably responsible for it in terms of how the algorithms are designed to drive us to more and more extreme viewpoints or positions. I mean, what's the role? I mean, is social media here a cause? Is it an effect? How are you kind of thinking about social media in this moment?
I think it's an accelerator. I don't think it's necessarily a cause. I agree that these problems are not necessarily new, but they are definitely new in in I think the intensity and the speed. I'm looking a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about this and talking to people about this and talking to lawmakers, et cetera, and viewing their conversations. We've had like multiple hearings with tech CEOs in front of Congress in the last just since the election, and there's this issue of speech that we seem to be very focused on when we talk about this, right? Like whether we're talking about censorship or whether we're talking about, just a glut of misinformation and speech that is dangerous and what to do about it. And fundamentally, I think when you're thinking about social media's role in this, we're not really thinking about it usually the right way. I mean, this is not really a free speech issue as much as it is an attention issue. Like the platforms are rarely deciding on issues of speech, what is to be banned, what is not allowed. I mean, they do that in some extreme cases with hate speech, but when you really get down to it, what this is this is an amplification platform. Like what we see on a platform like Facebook or even Twitter. It's not a raw feed. It's not just you see every single thing that the people you follow throw out there. You see an algorithmically curated feed. You see, things are amplified and promoted based off of how popular they become and based off of sort of the architecture of these platforms. And so I think the way that I'm thinking about this whole conversation right now is that we're stuck on these issues of like what speech should be allowed, what should be what is dangerous, what is not. Those are important questions for sure, but I think they sort of elide the bigger point here, which is these are amplification platforms. These are megaphones. These are ways for people to gain audiences. There's a lot of money to be made off of this, and these platforms are designed in a specific way to reward incendiary content, to reward content that shares, that it evokes very strong emotions. And what we've seen is that gives a natural advantage to a certain kind of person. And the emotions that travel fastest are these ones that are usually divisive. They're usually a bit toxic. And so the way that I'm thinking about this right now is it's been a real struggle, honestly, because I've emerged as a critic of social media companies and have this platform where I can write pretty get a lot of attention to these pieces. And I'm coming up against a problem, which is that I don't really have new or interesting things to say about a company like Facebook. I think that it is, by design, it is broken and it has failed. It is rewarding a type of content and sentiment that is slowly pulling us apart and making it harder to find that shared reality, but also, as was just mentioned here, making it easier for us to distrust each other and hate each other um, and to divide us. And so I think, I've written this before, but I don't think Facebook can be reformed in the sense of making tweaks on the margins. I think what we are seeing with social media is we have run up against a fundamental issue. If we are going to port our our public square in our discussions and sort of our, that back and forth, which is the backbone of a healthy democracy, if we're going to port those over to these platforms and they're going to choose to privilege the most incendiary version of every critique and comment and the most bad faith arguments, then, we're not going to be able to have a healthy conversation and a healthy democracy. So I think they're, to some degree, beyond saving and need to be sort of rethought from an architectural perspective.
So the business model, fatally flawed in a way, fatally corrupt, perhaps. Are you willing to go that far?
Fatally corrupt, because not fatally flawed.
Well, yeah, you're right. It's a very good business model.
Exactly. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that these are easy questions, rather that they have easy answers. I think, far from that. It's really difficult. But I spend a fair amount of time talking to people inside these companies, good people, right? People who are trying to help, and a lot of the fixes come up against the fundamental nature of the business model, and that's always that's going to win out every time. So I do think these questions are a bit existential for these platforms.
So can we look at kind of, we're not going to solve the sort of how to re-engineer these platforms or throw them out the window today, but can we evaluate kind of the actions the platforms took in the lead up and in the aftermath of the election? I mean, they're prominently sort of labeling tweets about election fraud or irregularities with labels. There was the case of the platforms kind of throttling the stories about Hunter Biden in the lead up to the election. How are you feeling about given these sort of baked in problems? How have the platforms responded? How are you kind of evaluating what they've been trying to do to address some of these concerns?
I think it's a really disjointed response. And I think that's because there's many different problems that they're trying to solve, right? So from the sense of a foreign interference problem, information operations that are coming from professional, foreign governments, or sort of domestic people trying to conduct propaganda campaigns at scale to influence and impact our election. I've spoken with, the leads at Facebook and at Twitter on these teams, and they're doing a fantastic job. I mean, their job is not to, moderate content necessarily. It's to, ferret out these coordinated, inauthentic campaigns full of, bots or sort of manipulation of real people and real accounts and things like that, to sort of create a fake false narrative. And that's been incredibly successful. I mean, if you look at the way that 2016 there was a really dominant narrative of like foreign interference. That did not come to pass as a result of these teams inside Facebook and Twitter and other places working pretty feverishly over the past year and a half, 2 years to combat this. And so I think they should be commended on that front. I think they've made a job very difficult for those folks. I think from an organic domestic standpoint, a lot of the misinformation and disinformation is coming from inside the house, right? It's coming from certain, it's coming from one of our two dominant political parties at this point. And I think in that sense, Facebook has especially more so than Twitter, and YouTube has failed as well. But they've failed catastrophically. I mean, if you go and and look, I mean, Facebook is awash as we speak in content that seeks to undermine, our collective faith in the results of the 2020 election. Conspiracy theories abound. They're checked poorly, I would say, with these labels. Some of my former colleagues at BuzzFeed News reported this week that Facebook has internal data that shows that the labels that they put on Donald Trump's posts when he claims that he's won the 2020 election or has won the state of Michigan or the state of Georgia are barely effective, 8% effective in deterring shares and deterring people from, amplifying those messages. And yet that's all they do, and I think that there's a real inaction inside Facebook because, my reporting has showed that there's a real fear of being seen as politically biased, a real fear of seeming to have put a finger on the scale at all on this election, and that sort of leads to inaction, and that inaction benefits the Trump campaign or benefits just generally people who are sort of looking to seed mis and disinformation. So I'd say that's a long-winded way of saying it's a real mixed bag. I think that certain things we've really learned how to deal with outside threats, and I think that we're just generally very good at sort of taking action against foreign elements in American life. And I think we have a real problem examining what's coming from inside the house.
Bryce, your thoughts?
So obviously there's the supply side, and that's what the platforms are. And in some sense, I think I agree that if we snapped our fingers and we just shut all the platforms down, that things would get better to some degree. But the demand is still there, and the opportunity for a person to operate in bad faith, I'll use economic language. We call them hate entrepreneurs, uh, to still put that hate out there, whether it's through talk radio or a cable television station or whatever it is. So in some sense, we can do some stuff on the supply side, and we should do stuff on the supply side to make it harder. Because ultimately, look, if you look at if we say, look, there's a goal here of us having shared reality, of getting to truth. If you go through all of the places where that's a fundamental feature, we have some amount of gatekeeping on the supply, right? So in the court of law, you're not allowed to just walk in and say whatever you want, right? There's, legal penalties and all sorts of gatekeeping about what actually shows up and gets testified to in a court. If you go to science, you know, we have a whole process of, how do you get to contribute to science? Well, you have to basically add something to science, and that gives you the credibility to then comment on it. And we kind of have a whole peer review system. Look, and it's not to say that any of these systems are perfect, but I think if we're going to say yes on the supply side, we probably need to do more than just let anybody have wide amplification. But at the end of the day, part of what we have to do is we also have to get to the demand side, right? We have to start working on doing more so that people aren't, we have to ask the question, why aren't people trying to find out? Because the internet makes it really easy to find the truth. If you really want to know the truth about something, it is as easy as it has ever been to find truth. The bigger question is why do so many of us not want to find truth? And how do we get more of us to want to find truth? And I don't think I have the answers to those questions, so I'll volley it back to you two to see if you have any thoughts on it. But that's kind of the framework that I use.
Charlie, I'll let you jump in. Do you have a response to that?
Well, I think we're going to figure it out right here. So get ready. No,
That's right.
I think that's a fantastic point, and it's almost peculiar how little it comes up, that supply side versus demand side thing, and it's probably where I end up feeling the most pessimistic, right? Because I think you're totally right. Like, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what either tweaks or what rules we can put in place to sort of make this stop, or not stop, but stem the tide a little. Sort of push the barbarians back from the gate, whatever you want to say. And I think the demand part of this is incredibly important. I've done a bit of reporting around the QAnon conspiracy theory and talking to different researchers and talking to people who've actually been involved and have sort of gotten themselves out of that rabbit hole a little bit. And the thing that they always bring up to me, which I find really illustrative, is the idea that these conspiracy theories, including QAnon, they provide an easy framework for understanding the world. They provide a lens through which to see it. They provide even more importantly, they provide a community of sort of like-minded people who are accepting to them, and that it fills a whole series of emotional needs, and I think that when I sort of really get into it with people like this, I think we always get to the notion that there are larger, forgive the sort of cliche word, but there are larger systemic issues at play here. So much of when you really drill down into it, my reporting has shown that a lot of extremists and a lot of conspiracy theorists and you can trace a lot of it to the 2008 financial crisis and sort of a hollowing out of the middle class and people feeling left behind and people turning inwards, people getting laid off and spending more time at home and more time on the internet and finding community there. And I think that retreat inward is really important, especially as we sit through, we're living through this pandemic.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
Hi, I'm Nora Sachs. I'm the host and reporter of Richest Hill, a podcast from Montana Public Radio, and you're listening to A New Angle.
I was talking to a colleague in the United Kingdom who works for the Times this week, and they were saying that there's a real worry in the country right now as they're in the middle of a very real lockdown to try to keep COVID under control, that these lockdowns really drive up recruiting into online extremism because people are forced into these positions with little to do. And so, I think that when you look at trust in, government, when you look in trust in the media, when you look at, unemployment or, economic inequality, all these issues, like, I mean, they're obviously all connected to this. And I think that there is a real group of people who have understandable reasons to distrust institutions and feel wronged by them and left behind. And I think that provides the demand. So I think I think we're stuck in this cycle. What really just is very difficult for me is, these people get stuck in a cycle and then contribute to further undermining the trust in the media and in government. And it makes those institutions less effective at doing their jobs, and then gives those people more and more reason not to trust them or believe in them or want to get involved. And so it seems like we're stuck societally, in America at least, in that pattern. And I think some things need to break there in order to decrease, what we're calling the demand side.
And do you think it's symmetrical in any ways? I mean, it's easy to sort of cast aspersions on the other side of the political aisle and think that, we've got it right and they've got it wrong. But are there these effects on both sides of politics in the country right now?
I think so. I do. I mean, I think I want to be very clear that I think in terms of like disinformation and, sort of anti-democracy and minority rule. I really do think there's an asymmetry there. I mean, I think if you just look at the the unwillingness to accept the results of the 2020 election by a large swath of Republicans, I think that, I mean, that's damaging in ways that are just so patently obvious. But broadly speaking, like absolutely, I write a fair amount about the media because I'm critical of them. I'm critical of. I think broadly there hasn't been a great adaptation to a lot of these trends, especially like the ones that are manifest first online. And I think it's been very slow to do that, and I think very slow to sort of recognize a lot of this stuff, and it causes some of this distrust. But I think a really good example of how this is playing out on both sides is this pandemic, and there's a couple examples recently of Nancy Pelosi and Democrats in the House setting up a like big indoor dinner last week in the Capitol building for all the new class of congressmen and women, and being sort of excoriated for that. Or you have Gavin Newsom in California having dinner at the French Laundry, and there's this idea that rules for thee and not for me, and things like that do just such damage to public trust and feeling like that this anti-elite sentiment, or feeling that the ruling class isn't subject to the same rules as the working class, or as average people. And I think that is just a very strong undercurrent in a lot of our politics right now. I think it's just very performative. It's very focused on fighting culture war battles. It's very focused on winning and getting reelected and fundraising and all these issues, and it does great damage to our larger trust.
Bryce, you looked like you were going to jump in with a comment there.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that's right. I mean, like, a lot of this stems from how do you rebuild trust, right? I mean, that's how you deal with the demand side, and then when basically, which is hard because anytime you slip up, well, that's an erosion of trust. And what we need is grace, right? We need to allow people to make mistakes, and allow them to prove their intention over longer periods of time. But we also need more effective means of punishment, right? And that's one of our problems I think we talked about a few episodes ago, Justin, right? Is with our politicians in particular, there's no punishment, particularly in a close election. And when you've divided yourselves into tribal identities, is, oh, great, you're out there undermining the election itself, but those Democrats are socialists, and I can't have, I was, I read a bunch of things post-election on, how could you still vote for Trump, and people explaining how could they still vote for Trump. And if you read through them, like, I'd say a majority of the reasons that people are citing are usually that Democrats are evil in some way, which, if you really do research on it, is almost entirely untrue. It's like, oh, they're socialists. And well, what does it mean to be a socialist first? Because based on the actual definition of socialism, there's only a couple that are truly socialists. And it's like, well, they're going to do this. And it's like, well, no, that's not likely to happen. Particularly if you actually understand the process of who the marginal senator is, or who the marginal representative is. And but yeah, the lack of ability to punish bad behavior, particularly when it comes to not just politicians but large institutions, whether it's the media or particular media organizations. We have one of the great frustrations I think that people who pay attention have is that they're like, I know that you're not telling the truth right now, and I want you to be punished for that. And then you're not punished for it. In some sense, that was the whole sentiment that Charlie was talking about with respect to the election, right? The fact that it was so much closer than people thought it, quote, should be, given the bad actions that preceded it, with respect to the pandemic, with respect to undermining, norms of democracy and corruption and all these kinds of things. And, if we don't have a means to punish bad behavior, it's really hard to reestablish trust, right? I mean, the standard game theory approach is you play tit for tat with random bits of forgiveness here and there to see if, once I'm punishing you, I give you a chance every 10 times or whatever it is to see if you've learned your lesson and are willing to cooperate. And, right now we can't even do the tit for tat. It's just kind of, yell and scream into the ether. And, there's no means to get it under control via, some collectively agreed upon norm. And so then we start saying, well, we need to use the state power to enforce the norm. And that's when you get up at a whole other different bailiwick of, cultural political issues that, well, do I really want the state involved in this? And so I don't have a great solution to it. I just think that, I can point you to where it needs to go. Yeah, we need to work on the demand side. We need to work on restoring trust. And so it is harder to undermine all of these institutions and spread misinformation. But I'm very pessimistic that we have many levers at our disposal that will actually succeed.
So talking about potential solutions, and Charlie, a moment ago, you mentioned your colleague in Great Britain. We've got a great listener question this month from one of our graduate students. I'll play it now.
Hey Charlie, my name is Nate Bender and I'm a graduate student at UM. I'm concerned about how sustainable it is to count on big tech companies like Twitter and Facebook to, in essence, make their products worse when they curtail their algorithms to combat disinformation at key moments like the election. Are there examples of other countries effectively putting regulation or incentives in place that show more power than our current state in the US of just hoping powerful people will do the right thing for democracy?
So it's difficult. I think it's actually, I think this conversation has trended really well into this question because first I'll give an example, right? There's actually a really good piece in the Washington Post from August 10th this year by a Kennedy School of Government graduate and Foreign Service officer that was talking a bit about how Taiwan works to counter Chinese disinformation. And it's a multi-step approach, which is, monitoring media platforms, trying to, debunk, sort of use things like memes to disseminate correct information properly. It worked really well. The government worked really well with public health officials with coronavirus, things like that, and trying to sort of take political leaders out of it and make sort of apolitical leaders the face of these types of crises, so that you sort of de-escalate. And that actually, that's not like a platform moderation thing, but it really does help to sort of take these people out of it. And then a real focus on education, media literacy, working on that, in schools and from a very early age, giving people the tools to deal with this. But they also developed laws that have helped. I think there's called an anti-filtration law to deter Chinese interference in elections. These are less almost platform things and more like we're talking about consequences, right? Consequences for bad actors, because it's really hard for there to be. These platforms are so big. There's so much going through them. It really is hard to find meaningful ways to regulate. But if you have very serious penalties that can be placed on people who directly do meddle and cause harm, that can be proven, I think that's a decent disincentive. But bringing all that up, I think what we were talking about earlier with how do you fix some of these problems. I really do think it comes down, whether it's the platforms or whether it's our politics, it's all an issue of governance, right? I think we're saying, do you want the state to get involved, in some of these big problems, and there's a real reticence there. It's similar to the idea of, do you want the platforms to really get involved and to censor and do whatever. In government, the answer is actually, I think, a little bit easier because you do. And then if you don't like the decisions, you can use the the means of politics to vote them out. I think what we're stuck in right now is a government that is so ineffective, that is so willing to actually use the levers of democracy, that we don't really, people don't see their government at work, and that, that helps lose trust. And I think, as a result, politicians are really afraid to do things and to propose ambitious legislation and to you know to do that. And people, disinformation peddlers and propagandists are really trying to to make it harder for them to do their jobs and to make them afraid to do them. And I think it's similar to the platforms, right? The platforms are afraid to intervene and be called politically biased and to do things. So we have a governance problem on all ends. And what ends up happening is a paralysis. And the paralysis always benefits the the bad faith actors, the people who are willing to exploit the system. And so that's where I think we are. So when we talk about this example from Taiwan, this is a really aggressive government approach to something that they deem as a large problem. And it both is focused a little bit on the platforms, but broadly also focused through policy initiatives that are aimed at the culture and aimed at its citizens. So I think we focus so much on what is this fix that we can do on this platform? What is this? And I think we really need to empower institutions to take control of, or empower, the leaders in these institutions to take control of them and to use them, and then exercise sort of the democratic ability to say, well, we either, like what you did or we don't, and your time is done. So I think it's a lack of governance problem.
I think that I really thought that was a great answer, and I love that it's Taiwan again, right? Because Taiwan obviously is one of the leaders in the pandemic, and it's like maybe I should be looking more at Taiwan and learning more about it. But yeah, I mean you're right. The issue is we have power. We invest the state with power, and we have elections in theory to allow us, the people, to direct that state power and hold it accountable when we use it in ways that we don't like. And yeah, we've kind of broken all the institutions, so we don't think that works very well. Certainly not at the federal level, but there's a whole bunch of other levels of government that hopefully we could maybe get some action out of. But yeah, so I think that's right on. I think that the we need to stop basically begging Mark Zuckerberg to do what we want him to do, and because technically the economic incentives are entirely against us, right? What Mark Zuckerberg is doing is the right thing for the business. It's the right thing for the shareholder. It just may not be the right thing in terms of amplifying truth as opposed to amplifying emotion. Um, and what we want is to say, you know what, we should probably do more amplification of truth rather than emotion. And here are some levers that we could pull without having to basically be in the let me kneel before you, rich person, in control of the platform and hope that you do what's right. We have to be willing to take back. If we don't like what's happening in society, the whole point of democratic governance is that we have a say in saying we don't like what's happening in the society and we want it to be better. And obviously, we have institutional barriers to that happening, but certainly, I like the empowerment there, that it's not just feel bad as you look at the world around you, but there is a direction for action that isn't just plead with Rupert Murdoch and Mark Zuckerberg to do the right thing.
Well, and I think from the governance perspective, it goes even further than that too. It extends to a platform like Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. Like, they are, in the same way that Congress is, terribly afraid of doing things and paying any price for their actions. But by not doing these things, it gives cover to everyone to sort of just kind of exist on the platform and feel kind of bad about it. But if they were to really say, okay, this is the speech that isn't allowed, or this is the type of behavior that isn't allowed, there would be a lot of people who would leave the platform. They'd be able to there would be a referendum on it. And just similarly, like, people might vote with their with the clicks of their mouse not to use Facebook anymore because they feel that it's not worth their time. And we're just in a period of these of just great stagnation. And I think, whether it's Congress or whether it's Facebook, we're all living with these institutions and generally feeling kind of terrible about them. And they're not giving, the institutions themselves aren't really giving us any room to move or do anything with them. So I feel like it's just this great stagnation is giving these institutions some cover to fail us.
Well, and I think and all of us personally. I mean, I feel like, within the last 2 days, you tweeted about how much you hate being on Twitter, right? We're all currently living with this, like, I don't really want to be here, but I also like, there's things on here that are good that I would like, that I like, and there's just constant tension with, and everybody is now choosing different mixes. I feel like there's a lot of more. I don't go on that one anymore, but I go on this one. But like, yeah, it's all, we're all in limbo, because it's like the platforms are afraid to do things differently because they're afraid to lose a big chunk of their user base, because that's their business model. But then they're all kind of doing the same thing, so there's not like I can go, what I really want is purely academic Twitter, right? So essentially, like, oh, like, you have to, if you could keep, basically, like, I want the algorithm to learn that, like, I want to be informed and not, inflamed, right? Even though my actions might show that I'm more interested in being inflamed. My actual interest in going on to, when I open up Twitter, I'm not doing it because I want to feel bad, right? Even though if you look at how long my eyes linger on and what I click on, yeah, it might be more of that. But what I really want out of Twitter is the people who elevate, interesting facts about the economy. And again, I'm an economist, so I'm weird. But like, I want the, oh, hey, here's what's happening with the pandemic and the economy. Here's what's happening. Here's an interesting paper that, somebody just wrote. That's why I still actually log on. Facebook never provides me with that, so I don't go on Facebook at all anymore. But what I did like about Facebook, and what if somebody could give me, if it were just my kids, my friends' kids, I would probably go back on it, right? But I don't go on Facebook because I don't want to hear what the random person from high school thinks about Donald Trump.
Right. I have a piece coming out in the near future that explores this sort of phenomenon and where we are, especially with Facebook, where I got two older Facebook users from different parts of the country to give me their Facebook passwords, and I lived in their feeds for a long time.
Oh God!
And
Wow. Nice.
And this, what I really learned is sort of what you're describing here, which is Facebook was this place where a lot of connections were formed, a lot of people reconnecting with weak ties in their network, people from high school, whatever, and it was joyous because it was just sharing small little life updates. It was a little bit voyeuristic, getting to see who got fat, who got married, who got whatever, and it was lovely. And then around 2013, around 2014, Facebook changed the platform substantially towards news and links and sharing. It became a lot more political, and these weak ties, these people who, the folks whose Facebook accounts I was in, they hadn't seen these people in 35 years, and yet they were these people who they barely knew were their primary vectors for information, and it turned and basically weaponized these connections into this sort of political information sphere, and it's a very weird phenomenon that we're all dealing with. And the end result was that both of them were miserable because of this. They're not conspiracy theorists. They're not bad people at all. They were miserable, and yet they couldn't look away because the misery. They were trying to understand it and trying to cope with it, and they needed to be on the platform to try to talk people out of their opinions or whatnot. And we're just seeing that happen at scale, which I think is a pretty wild thing, and it's a great example of this idea that we're stuck in these stagnant information and political ecosystems that make us feel awful, but we don't really know how to leave them.
Well, I think, Charlie, we probably have to find a way to land this ship. I want to be respectful of your time. Speaking of like figuring out ways through this, I am 2 weeks into life with a light phone and feeling quite good about it, not missing any of that colored stuff on the iPhone. So anyway, in our final segment here, we talk predictions. You mentioned stagnation, but there seems to be a lot in the offing in the near term. Charlie, start with you. Do you want to join us in making a prediction?
Sure. What's our time scale?
Yeah, so basically before the 25th of next month, so between now and Christmas, basically, what do you think is going to happen?
Wow. I hate to. I feel like I am just always I walk around the world as like the killjoy all the time. I think that we are in the next month. I think we will see a further erosion of the Trump case of I think the Joe Biden presidency will become more and more accepted by all members of the political party. This is more of a hope than a prediction. But then I also think we're going to be dealing with a truly unprecedented issue in the pandemic. I just spoke with an ICU doctor this morning who told me that they believe Thanksgiving Day will determine the course of the country for the next 6 months and whether or not people adhere to the advice. So I have a real. I'm really hoping I'm wrong on this one as well, but I have a fear that next month we will be dealing with a pandemic that's just truly out of control as a result of a lot of people not doing what they need to be doing in the coming week.
We can see the car coming at us. It'll be a question of whether we can get out of the way or not. Bryce, how about you? Your prediction?
Yeah, my prediction is also pandemic related, and it's also grim. I mean, the beauty of we now have enough data. We actually understand the functional relationship, so it's really not that hard to predict the future now, right? So if you just look at however many cases we see nationally today, we know that in 3 weeks, somewhere between 1.5 and 2% of that number will be dead. Um, and so we know that pretty much guaranteed, even before we get to Thanksgiving, that come early, middle December, we're going to hit new records for daily confirmed deaths, right? Obviously, there's excess mortality beyond the confirmed deaths. And so, now we basically, it's, well, how bad are we going to get with cases? And while I would like to think that, so right now what we're dealing with is we're dealing with the aftermath of the Halloween/election spikes. Those spikes are very clear in the data. Basically, wait a week after an event and you'll see a spike. So a week after Halloween was when this thing really spiked up at a different level than we were at. We were already growing before that because of just people moving inside because of the colder weather. But then we supercharged that with Halloween, followed 4 days later with the election, and we saw this 4-day plateau that we actually are coming down from now. And if that were the end of the peak, then yeah, by December we would be back to not having growth anymore if we came down from that peak at the same rate we came down in the summer. But obviously, it's still getting colder and colder in more parts of the country, and then Thanksgiving is just an absolute massive danger, right? It is people who don't usually mix together getting together indoors for a prolonged period of time. And just to add some data, I pulled up the American Time Use Survey, and on Thanksgiving Day, relative to other days in November, the average American spends 2 hours less alone
Wow.
than they do normally, and they spend 10 times more time with non-household people. So hopefully this drops on Tuesday. Obviously people still need to meet their needs, and that's part of the problem that we have with our messaging with pandemic, right? Is it's been going on for a long time. People need to meet their needs. There's a need for family. There's a need for community. There's a need for social interaction. But if you at all can meet those needs in ways that involve masks and being outside, do it that way. don't go inside and mix with a bunch of people that you don't already mix with, because if we get to, if we continue on the trajectory that we're actually on currently, there's a really good chance that by early December, we'll be at 300,000 cases a day, which then puts us at, over 5,000 deaths a day by Christmas. And I don't think any of us want to live in a world where, we're double where we were in terms of deaths per day in April on Christmas. So if that can help motivate you, please reduce your interactions while still trying to meet your needs.
Indeed. So two somewhat grim COVID-related predictions. I guess I will scrap my COVID-related prediction. Maybe I can save it for next month. Maybe it'll be obvious. I'm going to go back to social media and say, maybe, I don't know, take this as optimistic, pessimistic, however you want. Probably where you sit is where you stand on this. But January 21, Twitter bans the Donald Trump account. We'll see what happens.
It might take a little bit longer, but I think that it won't surprise me if that happens at some point, or at least long-term suspensions.
Well, their main sort of rationale for, tolerating the violations of the usage standards kind of goes away. Perhaps, we'll see. Stress test of some of the policies, I suppose. Then again, back to your point, Bryce, we're sort of hoping for these companies to do the right thing. I don't know if that's a very strong position for us to be in. Charlie, this has been fantastic. I appreciate it. I know we went over time a little bit. This has become, New Angle has become a little bit of a regular stop for New York Times opinion writers. We had Maureen Dowd a year or two ago, now Charlie Warzel. Charlie, can you set us up with Kara Swisher or Ross Douthat, or maybe Bryce wants to talk to Paul Krugman. So hopefully you can hook us up in the future.
I will do my best. They're all wonderful people. And I'll actually, as you know, much more accessible than people think. So I'll do my best to get this next on their whistle stop tour.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much. Be safe. Have a happy and healthy Thanksgiving, and I'll see you down the road.
All right, you as well. Take care.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. A New Angle is underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, with support from the University of Montana College of Business and Consolidated Electrical Distributors. AJ Williams is our producer. Jeff Ament, John Wicks, and VTO made our music, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. If you have any questions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. If you like what you heard, tell your friends about us. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.